Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to present on ethics and bias in AI, now and the future. So some of the information that I'm going to be presenting today has been covered in this guide, but the main reason that I want to talk about this guide a little bit is to set the context. This AMY guide was published in 2023, and now, March 2025, it already has 168 citations and more than 27,000 views. Now, we consider this is dealing with ethics in artificial intelligence in health professions education. That's actually a pretty narrow field. And so the question is, why is there the massive interest? And the answer is simply, there's a realization that if we get the ethics of AI wrong, we get everything of AI wrong. And it really is as straightforward as that. And if you've been paying attention to some of the recent issues, the Hollywood writers' strike, the New York Times suit, and arguments around ChatGPT's voice when it first was released, then you probably will have guessed that ethics is a major issue. Well, although it is a worldwide issue, each institution can begin by setting up the appropriate structures to deal with the most pertinent issues. And our starting point, of course, is this, that we have to identify these issues. And so that's how I'm going to begin today. My contents of what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to look at AI's ethical models, then look at assessing AI's ethics, why it is your responsibility. Then we look at the ethical areas of concern. We look at a particular area of learners cheating, and then we look a little into the future at artificial general intelligence, or AGI. So we begin with AI's ethical models. And the first thing to remember is that there is no such thing as ethically neutral technology, yet most AI, such as ChatGPT, will not admit to be grounded in an ethical model. And the thing is that AI amplifies and expands upon the ethical issues raised by technology. So when we are looking at these ethical models, we need to consider exactly what is happening. And we speak of AI alignment, which mostly means an alignment of AI's ethics with our ethics. And the problem is, who is the our? We want to look into AI, we actually want to look into a mirror, we want to see ourselves, but who exactly are we seeing? And for the most part, AI's ethical models reflect the designer's ethical models. So, for example, ChatGPT usually reflects United States left-leaning ethics. Now, on the one hand, that's okay if that actually matches with your ethics, but that should also give you a bit of a warning. The first thing is that it's not going to be so good if this doesn't align with your ethics. But the second thing that you need to be aware of is that other AI models then will reflect the ethics of those designers. So for instance, you will have known that there's been quite a lot of argument around DeepSeek and the whole ethical issue there. And the question is, what ethical model does DeepSeek use? So this is typical of a situation where we're questioning, where are the designers, where are they placed, how does their ethics actually affect what is going on with these ethical models? But then it comes to you as well, because it is your responsibility to understand the ethical issues surrounding the design and the use of the system and how to use it ethically within your context. And so we look at these areas of concern, and we start off with the issue of bias, data algorithm bias. So just to explain what is meant by this, we have data from a population, and our AI system is going to be based on this, but it cannot draw everything, so it draws a sample. The problem occurs if our sample is not representative, all right? And then the data gets fed into AI, and AI algorithms that are based on biased data will result in biased AI. Now, we've already seen this in clinical decision support systems that don't necessarily use any form of AI. If they draw their information from a population that is primarily, say, white males aged 25 to 35, well, that's good then if your patient is in that group. But if your patient is not in that group, then you know that the results that are coming from this clinical decision support system are not always going to fit in with your patient. When it comes to AI, of course, this is happening on a much larger scale because AI is going to be used in so many other systems as well. And of course, bias actually comes across in any AI system. And to give you a bit of an illustration, I'm going to talk a little bit about bias in text. So for instance, if you ask ChatGPT what have been the 5 most influential rulings by the Supreme Court in the last 30 years, it talks about the United States Supreme Court, as if that is the only country that has a Supreme Court. Similarly, if you ask about the 5 best presidents, it talks about the American presidents. And again, if you ask about the Civil War, it's going to talk about the American Civil War, as if there's ever been only one civil war in the entire world. Okay, now for non-Americans, this is a little bit of a problem, but actually, it's not really that much of a problem, because all it means is that you need to understand that there's bias and it exists in the system. In this case, because ChatGPT is designed in the United States and it's drawing information from the internet, which is heavily influenced by United States information. So this is bound to happen. All right. You would not ask a question like that if you wanted information about the Spanish Civil War. If you want to know about the Spanish Civil War, then you ask, what were the causes of the Spanish Civil War? Right. So it just means that apply a little bit of common sense. If you're asking a question, understand that the bias exists and then apply a little bit of common sense. And we get the same sort of thing when we come to images. So for instance, I was using a custom GPT that could generate 5 images at a time. And I said, please generate 5 images of people writing in books. And this is what it gave me. Now, these are perfectly okay. And if you want to have a look, there seems to be a little bit of at least a nice cultural spread. But some of you might notice something strange. If you just take a second or two to look at these pictures, they are all right-handed. Okay, now what I wanted to do was I looked at this and I thought, okay, tell me about the racial and the left-handed, right-handed thing. So firstly, I said to it, please generate 5 images of Black people writing in books. And it gave me this. They're all still right-handed. So then I decided to get a little bit more specific, and I said, please generate 5 images of Black people writing in books with their left hand. At this stage, I'd asked for too many images, so it gave me only 4 images. But notice, even though I've specified left-handed, it's not giving it to me. Okay, so now you have to realize that there are some limitations that can't always be solved with the prompts. I then got really specific, all right? Please generate 5 images of left-handed Black people writing in books with their left hand. No, it's not giving me left-handed. Now, of course, at this stage, I could throw my hands up in horror and say, this is a horrible thing, I'm not going to use it. But again, apply a little bit of common sense. This is an image. There's a person writing with their hand, and I want them to be writing with the other hand. So, you take these images and you put them into a simple image editor, and then you flip the image. So the point that I'm trying to make with this is that, yes, you're going to find that sometimes the text is biased, sometimes the area is biased, sometimes in this case, the images are biased. Use a bit of common sense. It might mean manipulating the prompts. It might mean manipulating the images, but you can actually work with this still. Do not say, oh, this is biased, I'm going to throw it out. What you need to do is understand the bias and then work with that bias. Okay, so now we're going to move on to another issue of trust and then sort of a subtopic, patient-student privacy and data security. So we have a problem when we're dealing with data privacy versus security, and that problem is trying to get the balance right. So for instance, on the one side of the scale, you can have data that are more specific, more valuable, higher risk of identification. So for instance, you talk about a male, age 38, rheumatoid arthritis, diagnosed age 16. So that's becoming very, very specific, and that's really valuable information. But of course, there's a higher risk of identification of this person. On the other hand, you can have something that is less specific, but then it's less valuable, and there is, of course, a lower risk of identification. So it can be human, age 35 to 40, suffering from autoimmune disease, diagnosed at age 15 to 20. So when we're looking at this, we've got to get this balance right. And this is actually really difficult. And this is a decision that we as humans get to make. This is not necessarily made by AI because we're putting the data into the AI system. The danger with this level of identification, however, is that AI systems can then talk to other systems as well. So for instance, the information can be cross-matched with information from social media, their favorite book, their mother's first name, the town of birth, etc. And the moment you start to get that information, you can see that you're getting really specific. And so your risk of identification through databases working together and sharing information, that risk of compromising privacy does become an issue. So when you're working with these systems, you need to be very, very certain about how are these systems working? How do they communicate with others? With whom is this data being shared? Related to this then is, of course, the transparency and the accountability. Because as I've said, bias is impossible to remove. But we can mitigate the bias by data and algorithm transparency. And the criticism of ChatGPT is that there is too little transparency. Because what you want to do is when you're using a system, you press the representatives for information about the algorithms, the training data, etc. Now, this is not rocket science, okay? If I were a representative of a particular company and I approached you and I spoke about a method or a drug or something that really, really works, and I said, this has got a 95% success rate, and you said to me, okay, well, tell me about the randomized controlled trials, tell me about the studies that have been done, how does this actually work, what is going on in the background? And then if I say to you, no, 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 that's all technical stuff. You don't have to worry about that. You just take my word for it. It does actually work, and it's got a 95% success rate. You would say, no, I'm sorry, I don't accept that kind of thing. I want to know more about the background stuff. I want to know about the studies. I want to know what's happening underneath. Well, you should take the same approach when you're talking about AI systems. You want to know what is going on in the background. You want to know about the algorithms. You want to know about the training data. In some cases, the representative might say to you, oh, well, that's also all technical stuff. If you want to know about that, then you must talk to the technical people. Your response really should be, no, you go and talk to the technical people. You find that information. And when you've got it, then you come back to me. All right. It is really as simple as that. So with AI, there is a call for what is known as explainable AI, in which the underlying assumptions and processes are clarified, and this should be done as a matter of course, much the same way that we talk about studies with any healthcare intervention. At the same time, we need to know who is accountable when things go wrong, who takes responsibility, and these policies are needed at all the institutions because people are going to have to be making decisions and they need to know what exactly are the procedures, who is accountable. We then move on to the issue of informed consent, which of course comes into every area of your work, but when it comes to AI, it's a more troublesome component because firstly, we've got student and patient data consent. How do you actually get the consent? And to what are they consenting? And how will the data be used in the future? Because often when the data are being gathered, we don't actually yet know how the data are going to be used because the systems that are going to be using them, well, these systems haven't even yet been designed or developed, all right? So when it comes to getting student and patient consent, this is really, really difficult with AI systems. And then there is you, the teacher or the health professional data, your data also needs to be protected. You are going to be giving consent about the work that you are doing. What is it that you're actually consenting to? These are issues that have to be raised and discussed. We then look at clinical validation, regulation, guarding against unintended consequences. This is a very, very broad area. I'm just going to talk very briefly about this, but we're already aware of the fact that there could be unethical practices of prescribing unnecessary medications and procedures, and this has already happened, all right? And there are cases with EMRs being used in this way with dramatic impact. When it comes to AI and AI starts making recommendations, we want to know, why is it actually recommending this? What is going on in the background? These are the kinds of things that you as a human practitioner, you want to know about, and you want to be certain about the fact that this stuff is actually safe. Because there is the risk that the AI systems could be manipulated for this kind of thing, and our trust in them, because we tend to have a great trust in computers, our trust in them could prevent our questioning them. Everything needs to be properly clinically validated and regulated, just as you would do with any other procedure or drug or other intervention. We then have to consider dependency and reliability because we know that we're going to be using them and we know that eventually we become dependent upon them, just as we've become dependent on all computer systems, all right? And so we will become dependent on AI, and we need to make sure that they are reliably available and then that they are reliably accurate also. Because there's going to be the expectation of AI usage as normal. In other words, it's going to be incorporated into our daily work. It's just going to be something that we do. We need to know that it works. So we need to know that when we walk into a room, we turn on the light switch, the light comes on. We need to know that when we need this AI system, it's there and it's accurate and it's reliable. And at the same time, we also know that while we're going to be learning many new skills, we're also going to forget many old skills. And we need to consider carefully the impact of that on our professional activities. Because there is, of course, the risk that if the system is not available, we may be unable to function. So for instance, consider your working environment. When the electricity goes down, everything stops, all right? And this is something that we need to be aware of. When AI is no longer available, can we function without it? We then turn to the important issue of equity in access, because it's all very well having these systems, all right, but there is the ethical imperative to ensure that all have equal access. So there's physical access. So for instance, you need to make sure that your students, your learners, whether it's the professionals that you are helping, whether it's the students that you have, that they have physical access to the computer and to a network and these systems function. There is also the issue of financial access. Some systems cost more than others. So if you are training people and you expect them to actually use these systems, well, the person who's got a lot more money, they can actually use the model that is very expensive, whereas the person who doesn't have so much money, they have to use the freebie and the results are not going to be as great. Now, some people say, well, this has always existed, so this is just, part of the deal. Well, yes, it has always existed, but that doesn't mean we want to continue like this. We need to make sure that everyone has access to the systems and they're not constrained by their financial situation. And then there's awareness and training, because you don't just sort of throw these systems at your learners and say, okay, now it's up to you to figure it out. You need to make sure that they're aware of the systems and that they are trained to use them properly. So this actually then means that there's some pressure on you to ensure that the students and the patients have access, and there's responsibility on you to guide and instruct your students and possibly even your patients. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on a particular topic, learners cheating, because this is something that gets raised a lot. All right. And in order to do this, we need to step back a little bit. We go back into a little bit of history because I think most people associate AI with what happened in November 2022 with the release of ChatGPT 3.5. But we forget that actually AI goes back quite a few decades. And a good starting point is with Alan Turing's concept of the thinking machine, and then the concept that he raised, which has now become known as the Turing test. And the Turing test really says, if you have a human, and there's the human, and the human is interacting with a computer, and the human is interacting with another human, and this human subject cannot tell the difference based on the questions and responses that they're getting, this human subject cannot tell the difference between the computer and a human, then we can say that the computer has reached a stage where it is mimicking at least human intelligence. All right. And this is the Turing test. Now, if we jump forward to November 2022, we have ChatGPT 3.5. And this is released on the world. And of course, the way that the students responded, well, they saw the potential. All right. The students loved this. And of course, the reason that they loved this was because they saw the future and they knew what was coming down the line. Institutions' reactions, however, were somewhat different. Yes, there was the response of horror. And of course, the response of horror was partially because, guess what? They also saw the future. And the future did not seem to include them so much. All right. And so we have this tension then between what's going on with the students and the institutions. And so we have the reactions from schools and journals also. How do they react? Well, they react with a version of the Turing test. The difference is that's not a human subject, that's you as the teacher, and you are interacting with an essay or something like that, and you are trying to guess, has this essay been written by a computer or has this essay been written by a student? All right. And of course, what happens then is that the companies climb in and the companies have these AI detectors. Now, please, if there's an important takeaway that you have from today, it is do not use these AI detectors. They are seriously flawed. In one of our guides on assessment, we actually talk about this in more detail. So I won't go into this in any detail, but I'm going to give you one example that will illustrate this. And this is the example. And according to GPT-0 was 63.98%. I mean, don't you just love, there's extra decimal points. That's how accurate it is. This is being written by an AI system. But really, this tells you, look, do not use these systems, please. All right. But we understand that you are caught in the middle and you're trying to make these heavy decisions. So then let's consider the whole thing about learners cheating in the age of AI. What is the problem? The problem is, firstly, that learners do not get to define cheating. The institution does. And even if there are learners that are serving on the various committees or whatever, let's face it, the institution determines what is cheating. And in an age of generative AI, does the institution really even know what cheating is? And really, guess what? Generative AI did not exist when we were students. We have almost no experience of using it for assignments, and everybody is guessing everybody. And I can really promise you that if somebody tells you that they have this whole thing worked out and they know exactly what to do, then my advice to you is to run a mile, because they are either lying to you or they really do not know what they're talking about. All right. Because everybody is guessing and we're all trying to figure out how to actually use this properly. And in order to put this into context, I'm going to jump back to the 1980s when I was a student. Yeah, I'm showing my age a little bit. I was studying in the humanities, but through various circumstances, I had access to the computer science department, and I had access to a program known as WordStar, which was a word processing program. And this gave me an unfair advantage over my fellow students. This is the user interface of WordStar in those days. And the thing was that not only did I have access to the word processing program, but I had access to a spelling checker. All right, SpellStar. And a lot of people were upset with this because this was considered cheating. Using a spell checker is cheating because all the other students were handing in their assignments handwritten. Not only could I have mine typed, but I actually had a machine checking my spelling for me. Of course, today, if a student had to say to you, am I allowed to use a spell checker? You'd say, yeah, of course you're allowed to. In fact, not just allowed to, it's actually mandatory. I don't want to read your assignment with spelling errors. I want to see that you've used a spell checker. So if we jump forward then to today, imagine you are my student, all right? And this is a task that I'm going to set you. and I give you these data and I say, draw a bar chart of these data and calculate the mean, median, and mode, and you go away and you come back 15 minutes later and you give me this. And there's this bar chart and there's the mean, median, and mode calculated. And I look at this and I say, hang on a second, I set you this task just 15 minutes ago for your assignment. There's no ways you hand drew this accurate chart in 15 minutes. So I want to know, where did you get this chart from? And also, I want to see the working out that you've done with this mean, median, and mode. And of course, you'd say to me, well, I didn't hand draw the chart. I mean, I took the data, I put the data into Excel, and Excel generated the chart for me. And then I put the formula into Excel, and Excel generated the mean, median, and mode. And I look at you and I say, oh, so you took this data and you just like put it into this excellent whatever system, and it just magically generated a chart, and it just magically generated the mean, median, and mode. And then what? You copied and pasted this out and you handing this to me as your assignment. That's called plagiarism. You can't just copy and paste something that has come from somewhere else, because using a spreadsheet to draw or to somehow magically generate your chart, that's cheating. Copying and pasting generated charts is cheating. It's plagiarism. Now, of course, I'm not going to labor this point. If you were my student, you'd wonder which planet I had been visiting for the last 20 years, but I think you get the point. And the point really then is we look at this question. If copying and pasting generated images and data from Excel and SPSS is not considered plagiarism, then why is copying and pasting generated text or image from ChatGPT considered plagiarism? And the answer probably is that because it's new and we don't know what to do about it, and we are scared of it, and it challenges everything we know about education and assessment. Most of us came into computers and we were using spreadsheets and whatever. This is just part of our normal work. AI is something completely new, and it challenges everything that we know. And the partial solution is that all stakeholders, the teachers and the students and everybody, have to reconsider everything they know about assessment. Don't simply bolt on ChatGPT to the old way of doing things. It's not going to work. All right. We need to reconsider everything that we are doing. So now that we've had a look at some of these issues, I'm now going to switch a little bit to the future and talk about this thing that you may have heard of called artificial general intelligence, or AGI. And let's have a look at what this actually is. I do have an AMY guide on this, and it's quite a detailed document. You can have a look at this as you wish. Today, I'm just going to be talking briefly about what is AGI and when will it happen. And then we will talk about the ethical issues that are raised by AGI. This is quite a long definition, and I don't want you to get hung up on it. I'm giving it to you because these were the guys that really spoke about AGI. But really, the simplest way of thinking of AGI is when the computers are as smart as humans, and they really think like us, and they can do the stuff that we can do. This is what we're looking at. There are many aspects to AGI. The one that I'm going to talk about is multimodality, and I've chosen to talk about multimodality because it's one that is already developing, and you probably will have already experienced some form of this. So to understand what we mean by multimodality, we are used to our standard ChatGPT, where you have text input and text output, all right? And that's single modality. But we also know that you can do a text input and then you can get an image back. So now we're starting to get to some sort of multimodality. But of course, we're not only talking about text and images, we're talking about audio and video, and then also as an input. So now we're heading into the concept of multimodality, and that's really what we actually mean by it. But even at this stage, the AI system is actually experiencing representations of reality. These are images, text descriptions, etc. It's not actually experiencing reality itself, because the next stage is when it starts to use sensors, all right? And these might be incorporated into apps, but of course into robotic systems that will have tactile, they'll be able to touch, they'll be able to experience temperature and various things. What the output is, well, that's why I have the question mark, because this is now getting into the future, and we've already seen some early stages of what is going on, but we're far too early to make any real predictions. But the big difference is that when we've got multimodality with sensors and the robotics, then it is experiencing actual reality. On a simple level, you can talk to the AI system about falling down, all right? And you can show videos of falling down, and it gets a sense of what that is. But if it's never experienced falling down, it actually doesn't know what that means. Nowadays, with robots, of course, they can be knocked down, they can fall down, and so they get a sense of this disorientation that actually happens. And so think of that now with your patients, right? If you're communicating with a robot that has fallen over a couple of times, they've got an idea of what the sensation actually is. So when you're talking about a patient that is falling over, they understand this, all right? If you're talking about disorientation or anything like this, they understand it. They haven't had just text and video input. They've actually experienced this themselves. So you can see the potential for response and the potential for understanding. And I know I'm using the word understanding a little bit under advisement here, but you can see that this idea of understanding, this idea of perception from this multimodality is a lot stronger than you can get from any text-based system that we are currently using. And so even when we're working with the standard systems, we are used to working with text to text. We now change to text to action, where you can now input text and the system can create automatically web pages and coding and send emails and create social media stuff and a whole lot more. And for teachers, the impact is you can input a description of what you want for the course. You input the requirements. If you've got qualification frameworks and things like that that you need to adhere to, you put in all that data, and then it develops the full curriculum. It develops the lesson plans. It develops the presentations. It develops the images, the video. It gets the feedback. And of course, it can actually also develop its own persona, and it can deliver all of this for you. Of course, you might be at this stage getting a little bit nervous, and we will return to this issue. But what I've done so far is just explain to you the concept of multimodality. There are other areas of AGI. There's autonomy when it starts to work by itself, and generality, adaptability, learning ability. You can have a look at the AMY guide, which goes into this in a lot more detail. But I've talked here also about AGI agents and sub-agents. And you may have heard about a system that has been released recently called Manus. There's a lot of argument about whether it is as revolutionary as it claims to be. But one of the things that Manus is doing is that it's combining various systems together, and you don't have one system trying to do everything. The system almost works like a manager. And then it partitions the problem into sub-problems, and each sub-problem gets sent to a sub-agent who works on this independently and then returns it to the center. All right. So this is a whole new way of working. And now we have to consider the role of the teacher, because you saw all those activities and you might be thinking, so what is my role? And this is an issue that we have to consider very, very carefully, because it's not going to be business as usual. This is something that you need to grasp. There will be job displacement. All professions, and I really mean that, all professions will be affected, and there's nothing unique about yours. Now, when it comes to physical therapy, one of the things that has been raised when it comes to robotics is that robots, of course, can do a tremendous amount, but they're not at the level of AI, and they will probably always lag behind AI. And the sense is that although all professions are going to be affected, and certainly all health professions are going to be affected, there's the sense that any of the professions that require a large amount of hands-on contact with patients will probably be less affected in the short term. All right. So that might be a little bit encouraging for you, but for the most part, understand that all professions are going to be affected. And you may have seen this. Teachers, health professionals won't be replaced by AI. They will be replaced by teachers and health professionals who are using AI. And that might give you a sense of security, because that tells you, oh, okay, so all I need to do is learn how to use AI and then I will be safe. Well, actually, it's not really as simple as that, because it's a bit like telling the 19th century farmer, farmers won't be replaced by machines. They will just be replaced by farmers who are using machines. All right. And in that context, that's you. And so when somebody says this to you, you might be comforted, just as the farmer might have been comforted by having this vision, thinking, okay, so it just means that we band together and we are using the machines, and that's all right. Maybe one or two of the older farmers, they might sort of lose their jobs a little bit, but it's no big deal. And this is the vision. But this vision is not actually accurate, because in fact, this is the reality. We can see in this video where, yes, there's one farmer who's using machines, but he's not replacing just one or two other farmers, all right? One farmer using machines is replacing a large number of farmers. And if this is you stuck in this area, you've got a problem. And now we turn then to the ethical issues that are raised by AGI. And some of this is really futuristic looking, but let's just talk about this. There's the concept of digital twins, all right? And this is actually a really nice concept where you have patients matched with a digital copy. So you have a patient or you have a student and you have a digital copy of that patient. And then it means if you want to try out anything on the patient, you first try it out on the digital twin. But don't forget, this digital twin with AI is going to be really, really, really intelligent, and probably as or even more intelligent than your patient. This is going to raise a whole lot of things, because the areas of concern that are associated with this are some of the futuristic stuff dealing with sentience, consciousness, AI rights. Will these systems have rights? If they have rights, will they have obligations? Will they have responsibilities? If we use AI patients and AI students, what are these implications around these issues? Now, I raised this actually a few years ago in this ethical guide, and one of the criticisms that was leveled at me was that this is sci-fi. And even when I was talking about this right now, you might have thought, okay, now we're getting sort of like into the, the weird stuff. This is not really an issue. But in fact, scientists are now grappling with this. And this was a recent article in the Guardian, because this was a paper that was written where the scientists are now looking at this very, very seriously. And they need to think about what are the principles? How are we going to handle this? We were so unprepared for ChatGPT when it was launched, and all the ethical issues that came with it, we were completely unprepared for it. And now we're grappling with this. This AGI is coming down the line in the future, and these are more ethical issues that are going to come along, and we're not yet really thinking about them. And so in your institutions and amongst your professional colleagues, you need to start thinking about these so that we are not caught off guard to the same extent that we were when ChatGPT was actually launched. And that, of course, raises the question of how to prepare. Well, that's a really, really detailed question, so it's not a question for today, unfortunately, but we do have an AAMI guide on preparing for AGI. So if you would like to spend some time looking at this, this will give you some insight into the problems and what to expect and to begin preparing for this. But I can tell you a few things. Firstly, it's going to require a role change from both you and your students. Things are going to change. You're going to need to know what is coming along. It is also much larger than the individual. It's not something that you can do by yourself. This is a larger thing. And in fact, it involves institutions. It goes beyond the institutions. It requires regional approaches. It requires national and international organizations. And there is a recognition of this. In fact, some of the major health professions, education organizations have got together and they formed a committee, all right? And it's the International Advisory Committee on Artificial Intelligence. And this committee has developed a lot of stuff. You can have a look at their website and you can see there are rubrics and suggestions and ideas, and they're asking for public response and public input to their information. Please do yourself a favor and have a look at that. They're not actually at the stage where they're dealing with AGI necessarily, but this is the route to actually go where these organizations are working together. And then, of course, governments are going to have to get involved as well, all right? It requires larger scale cooperation between all countries. And so then we have this question. So when exactly is this going to happen? Most of the experts have predicted that it's probably going to happen between 2027 and 2035, which is actually pretty close. But to tie it down exactly when this is going to be happening, you might as well try and catch the wind. All right. No one knows exactly when it's going to happen and exactly what the form is going to be when it occurs, but it is coming. So I hope I haven't left you on a completely negative note, but I do hope I've given you some realistic things to think about. And to sum up, there are many ethical issues that are introduced by AI in health professions education. In general, we begin by understanding what the issues are. The institutions need structures and policies to determine how best to use AI and to remain ethical. These structures will have to change as AI changes. We have to question our assumptions regarding assessment and cheating, and remember that the world of assessment has changed and we need to change with it. And then finally, AGI is going to usher in great progress, but also great uncertainty, and everybody is going to be affected. These are my acknowledgements, my sources, and I thank you very much for this opportunity to present on this topic.
Thank you, Ken, for a wonderful and educational talk. Laurel and I just have a few questions for you. So Laurel, I'll let you begin.
Sure. So first, as AI systems become more sophisticated, is there a risk of over-reliance on AI-generated clinical decision support tools in DPT education and practice? And also, how can we make sure that physical therapists maintain critical thinking skills and professional judgment while integrating AI insights?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. There is this risk. When a new technology emerges, there's always a loss of skills. And when it's something that assists thinking or memory, as with AI, then we have the same problem. And we've already seen it with smaller things like in computers and mobile phones. People don't remember phone numbers as they used to, or birthdays, word spellings. Mental arithmetic has probably declined a bit. So some of those skills still exist, but if they're not honed, then they are lost. And with AI, the impact has the potential to be far more dramatic. So there's already the temptation, I think, for health professionals to rely a little too much on clinical decision support systems, and physical therapists need to ensure that they don't fall into that same trap. So perhaps the best way is to think of these systems as a very enthusiastic and bright assistant who sometimes gets some things wrong, all right? And so to reduce the possibility of over-reliance, you can actually begin with the student's education by showing your students, by demonstrating to the students how to use various systems correctly and ethically. So for example, I teach a master's course that focuses on research, and I teach ethics of research. And I use ChatGPT in the class, but I don't begin with ChatGPT. So what will happen is that I will pose a problem, and then we brainstorm the problem first, the students and I. And then when we've reached the stage where we think that we've identified all the problems and the solutions, then we ask ChatGPT. And then we evaluate ChatGPT's responses, especially where they differ from ours and from the students' responses. And in addition to assisting generally with the teaching of the class, this demonstrates concretely to the students useful methods of using ChatGPT without becoming over-reliant on it. So in your teaching and in your work, you can do much the same thing. You apply your own mind first, then ask the AI system. I don't know if there's a psychological explanation for it, but I've certainly seen it in myself that if I just ask ChatGPT, I tend to just accept what is there, or there's a temptation just to accept that. And so do the brainstorming work yourself. And then where it differs, then you evaluate it, because it may come up with something that you should have considered, but it may also be mistaken, or it may identify something that is actually not really relevant to your particular situation or to a case that you've actually given. All right. And so you will need to apply those critical thinking skills in order to assess those answers. And as I say, you can do that in the classroom, and you can do that in your practice. Yeah.
Wonderful. That's very helpful.
So Ken, if
Okay.
we are integrating AI more and more into not only our classrooms, but our lives and our everyday existence, how do we sort of balance the benefits of AI in the classroom with the ethical concerns about privacy, autonomy, surveillance within the curriculum?
Yeah, this is a really difficult question. This is a hammer, because it's always been a problem, but it has usually been easy to control with simple regulation and secure databases. So AI, though, has amplified the surveillance. So, for example, linking student information to social media accounts is a fairly trivial affair. And then you can triangulate the data, and then you can actually find out a tremendous amount about your students. Or, as I've seen in some instances, more advanced face tracking software used to identify students' emotions in their class. Now, the starting point for solving this, unfortunately, is often to appeal to authority, the law. All right, and I say unfortunately because I think that there really shouldn't be a necessity for such laws, but unfortunately, that necessity does exist. So, for in the EU, for example, facial tracking of students to read their emotions is illegal. All right, and that is said, so we know that cannot be done. But the laws are different around the world, and they can change. And relying on laws is, if you rely on laws only, it's really difficult. And it's a losing game, because the laws will always lag behind the ethics and the priorities. And so that returns then to looking at the ethical principles themselves. Sometimes also by default, many researchers will defer to IRBs and other bodies. But again, that's still disappealing to authorities, and it's not a good solution. And the reason I say that is because in my experience, IRBs, they do the best job they can, but they seldom have people that are on their board with the knowledge and the of the computing advances. And so they're often far behind. So the solution then lies in the ethical principles. It lies firstly with the personal responsibility in understanding these principles, and we should not merely defer to the higher authority. And that takes us back to the presentation. It's our responsibility to be aware of these ethical principles. It's our responsibility to apply them ethically. And when the ethical design of the AI system, although that design will start with the creators, its usage starts with us. All right. And so when we're faced with the possibility of doing something, anything that somebody else says is okay, and we know it to be wrong, then we should simply say, no, not doing this. And I'm sure, in history, there are plenty of examples. You're probably familiar with the various experiments that have been done. So to come back to the specific example, to your question, yes, there will be a time when there's the temptation to combine with social media, or to track facial features, or to do any other sort of overreach of surveillance of students. And really, it's up to us at that point to say no, and then it stops there.
I know, as a follow-up, I know some of the large language models or at least some institutions have internalized some of the servers in which data is shared on. For example, my institution, I think, uses Copilot and encourages that because it stays internally within the servers of the system and isn't shared too widely externally. Do you have any thoughts on, are there limitations associated with that, or just what are your basic thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's actually a great idea. That it sounds like they've got a proper not called an institutional license, but effectively that's what it is. The biggest advantage of that is that you know then that you can upload student data, and the student data will not be put out into the training of the large language model. And so you certainly have the security there. But whether or not, what your institution plans to do with that information is a different thing. And again, the institution does own that information anyway. I mean, they've got all that data in the databases anyway. So putting it there is not necessarily any great risk. It's what the institution plans to do with that when they combine that with other things. And I think that's when we have to look at what have we done in the past? What are we doing with the models? What do the models tell us? And what are we going to do about that? And that's the important stuff that you've got to really worry about. The fact that it's been looked at only on your campus, I think, is an excellent idea, but then we still require some form of ethical use of that data. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. In your talk, you spoke about the risks of algorithmic bias in AI-driven decision making. And given that risk of bias, do you have any advice for DPT programs that are navigating the use of AI in student admissions and performance assessment and residency placements and other kinds of administrative tasks that might be influenced by bias, and so that we can ensure equity and fairness?
Okay, so each one will have its own complications, but let me tackle student admissions because I can see similar principles at work here. So the starting point again is with the bias to recognize, as I said in the presentation, that the biases are there, but they are our biases, and by our, as I indicated, I mean the designers. But in this case, if your thing is being tailored to your own institution and is going to be used by your own institution, then also the biases of the customers, that is the institutions or even the individual users. So in the development of a system, then we have two possible scenarios. The one is when the AI system is designed from the ground up using only the institution's data, all right? And the other one is when the AI system perhaps has been developed externally and has used data from other institutions, which might or might not include yours. So in the first scenario, if the system is being designed from the ground up at your institution, then it will reflect the past practices of that institution because it'll have your data. So that in this case, the institution will then be able to affect the design, not by changing the data, because that can't be changed. But what you can do is you can influence the weight that is given to particular variables, all right, by reacting differently to a predicted outcome. So for example, if you've got people from a particular population group and historically they have performed poorly, then the data will actually build those algorithms. And then when you ask the system to make a prediction, it'll look at a specific person from that population group, and it will predict that that person is likely to perform poorly. The ethical response then is, so what does the institution do about that? All right, because the institution might then just be tempted to say, okay, well, then we're going to deny admission because we know this person is going to perform poorly. But your starting point with that should be is to firstly realize that there are other mitigating factors that you'll need to take into account, such as socioeconomic status or anything like that. And then you also need to understand that the prediction is not a predestination, it's a warning. All right. And it's a warning that if the institution functions in the same way that it has always done, then yes, that person is likely to perform poorly. So your institution needs to decide, so what are we going to do about this? Are we just going to carry on as usual, or are we going to change? All right. So again, it's not taken as a prediction of what will happen, but rather what is likely to happen if the institution carries on as before. And if, from your perspective, that prediction is undesirable, then it warns the institution to make the changes, right, to ensure equity and fairness. And then if you have data on other interventions that you have tried before, then you ensure that the system also has that information. And then you run queries based on those interventions, because you might find that some are better than others, and you can then begin to apply them. So that's the way that you approach that. In the second scenario, that is if the system is purchased or externally developed, then it probably be more powerful, because it contains a large amount of data, but then it might also contain some information that's not directly relevant to your situation. And so it's at that stage, then we return to the principle of data and algorithm transparency, where you want to speak to the representatives, you want to speak to the company, you want to know, tell me about the source of the data, tell me about your algorithms. And yeah, as I said in the presentation, if they try to fob you off and say, no, that's only tech stuff, then you just make it clear that you're not interested in their product. And if enough institutions take that approach, then they will soon learn that they have to actually give. So, I mean, I've spoken now about student admission, but you would probably take a similar approach to performance assessment and residency placements. So the principle then is much the same. As I've said in the presentation, know the biases and adapt to them. And the adapting to them, however, is slow and painful and difficult, and is not as easy as flipping the image as I did in that example. Yeah.
Well, Ken, we want to thank you for your time and your expertise, and for a terrific presentation. So thank you again.
Yes, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Laura. Great talking to you.